Hello, everybody. My name is Ray. Welcome to the Evangelical Dark Web. Today, we're going to be talking about China and the lockdowns going on over there. And we're going to be talking about the Christian media's reaction, or in many cases, a lack thereof reaction to the events going on in Shanghai, most specifically. What we were saying is that China has enacted some of the most severe lockdowns in the last 2 years. It is so severe that they shut down everyone. They're chaining people in their own houses, and you're seeing very disturbing videos of people just screaming and, committing suicide. You're seeing stuff like that going on in China. And again, Christian media largely ignoring that. And I think that's an issue. And the reason why they're ignoring it is because they have not been told that it's important by the mainstream media. So consequentially, many of these Christian news sources aren't actually going to cover it. So the first one I want to talk about is Christian Post. Christian Post is definitely someone I want to call out more often this year because they're not as low-hanging a fruit. They do have a lot better of content, but they also have some really bad content. And one such bad content is the lack of content covering the Shanghai lockdown. It's non-existent. But you know what is existent on the Christian Post? They're still simping for Volodymyr Zelensky. They're hardcore simping for him. We're just going to check out this article. It came out yesterday. Ukrainian President Zelensky urges Biden to designate Russia as state sponsor of terrorism. Never mind the fact that Russia actually fought the Islamic State, whereas the United States was pretty much responsible for the Islamic State's existence. Never mind that. And we're supposed to believe that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the worst thing that's ever happened. And it's estimated that at least 1,982 civilians have been killed. 1,982 civilians. That is substantially less than 9/11. And we're 2 months into this war, and if you look at 2 months into the Iraq invasion, 2 months into the Iraq invasion, America killed, or not killed, but we're talking nearly 4 times the civilian casualties. Nearly 4 times the civilian casualties in the first 2 months of the Iraq invasion in 2003. So the first 2 months, and you're not going to see that from Christian Post. You're not going to see them do that mental math because they are extremely neoconservative. And neoconservatism and Christianity do not mix because you basically take the God out of conservatism. And, you have this article by Michael Brown. It's like, let's not get morally confused about Russia and Ukraine. And Michael Brown's the type of guy that is basically a functional apologist for entities like Bethel Redding and Hillsong and a bunch of other hyper-charismatic churches. So that's who Michael Brown is. So it's just ironic for him to talk about not being morally confused. Eternity News, this is in Australia. If you remember our good friend, the other Paul, he covers a lot of what Eternity News does. And Eternity News, likewise, radio silence on this issue. Church Leaders, which is Ed Stetzer's aggregating website. It's not a lot of original news, but a lot of it is aggregated from other stories. And again, radio silence. Radio silence. So you got this, the Babylon Bee criticized for anti-Asian racism. Because again, they're more interested in going after they're supporting the marriage. Or not the marriage. They're supporting the lockdowns and the narrative. And Church Leaders is just a terrible website. I hate this crap right here. Even publishing that article is just supporting the narrative. And then we got the Gospel Coalition radio silence on all of their various versions. Even their Chinese version has nothing on the lockdowns going on. It isn't And if we look at Reuters, they published an article. Uh, no, this was 2 weeks ago, but they're talking about the lockdowns that are in effect, and this article is surprisingly more critical of it. And just from reading it, it's far more critical. And if we go to Christianity Today, churches in Shanghai are stepping up during the lockdowns. It's written by Ava Chow, who is a Christian reporter in Shanghai. Now, this is why I hate assuming that every person who calls themselves a Christian in a different part of the world is a Christian, because I'm sure they have a lot of the same issues that we have. They have a corrupt religious establishment that we do. So I'm not big on just... I'm very skeptical when big even news sources like Christianity Today have Christian journalists in other countries reporting on what's going on there. It seems rather unreliable. Now, this article is actually pretty interesting because it touts the regime narrative. It has been a week since the beginning of lockdown. The day after he joined the neighborhood volunteer team, Pastor Zhu of GB Church received a white one-piece protective suit, a pair of shoe covers, and a pair of gloves, and a face mask. And everyone in this article's name has been changed. Their church name has been changed. And this article is very nonchalant about everything that's going on there. Since March, the Omicron variant has rapidly spread across Shanghai, a city of more than 25 million people. At first, city officials tried to contain the spread of the virus and reduce the disruption of normal life by sealing off individual buildings and residential areas. Very nonchalantly worded there. But by March 27th, the government issued a notice to a sequentially lock down Pudong, half of the city east of the Pujiang River, blah, blah, blah. The earlier strategy of fine-tuned containment was abandoned. All public transportation and most businesses were shut down, and almost everybody was ordered to stay at home and quarantine. By April 7th, the number of infections in Shanghai was in the tens of thousands per day, and for most neighborhoods, lifting quarantine was out of reach. Again, very pro-regime narrative there. But the consequences of lockdown have been devastating. Hemodialysis patients have been unable to receive treatment. Families with new COVID-19 infections had to follow a no mix of positive and negative quarantine policy that separated children from their parents. The shortage of medical supplies caused the disorderly management of mobile cabin hospitals has caused widespread anxiety in Shanghai, a city that prides itself on order and stability. Everyone knows the city is sick, but there seems to be no cure. Everyone wants to be helped by people. So it's just... So the point of this article is to say that churches are stepping up during COVID lockdowns 2 years later, when they're still doing COVID lockdowns in China, and it gets really cringe. When epidemic began in 2020, our church meetings moved online with offline small group access to ensure brothers and sisters still had face-to-face fellowship. Once the situation improved, we resumed offline physical meetings. At that time, none of our members' residential area was locked down, and everyone was still free to travel. But at this time, 100% of our members were sealed off in their own homes. And for the first time, we were confronted with the epidemic up close and personal when we had just looked on and made comments about the epidemic in other cities of China. Zhu said that 3 of his church's members had been infected with the virus, and although the church could not give direct help, they asked the church members to pray together for the infected. Members have spontaneously followed up with those who were sick and sent them prayer scriptures. Elders and care deacons mostly asked members how they were doing and prayed for them. CL Church especially encouraged members to pray not only with believers but non-believers. Rather than sending a praying free message, they stopped what they were doing and made phone calls to pray with those in need or to write down specific prayers. When our refrigerator at home is full, our spiritual condition is not necessarily better. But when our spiritual condition is better, we will not have inner anxiety when we see the refrigerator empty. So that refers to the fact that in China, they shut down the stores too, so you couldn't actually go out and buy food. So if you didn't have like 2 weeks worth of supplies, you were screwed, and many people were. Zeus Church started an online Bible reading program 2 weeks ago. For 1 hour, brothers and sisters read the Gospels aloud in segments via web conference, allowing God's Word to be a strength to one another. Soon after, church members initiated another reading by theme. After each person took a turn reading a passage, they shared intercession matters of their own or other related to that theme and used the passage to pray for themselves and others. This is the more interesting part. Love your neighbor is no longer just a phrase. GB Church offered a course on love your neighbor right before this round of outbreak. In its introduction, it stated that loving your neighbor means loving all people, including those we want to avoid, those we despise, and even those we find suspicious. It is not our responsibility to judge who is worthy of love, but to be good neighbors to meet the needs of others. The epidemic has made a big difference in Shanghai neighborhoods. The online group's purchase of vegetables and food must be community-based, and the length of the lockdown is based on community infections. Sure it is. The professionals, with their workplace skills, transformed into online group buyers for their communities. Disinfections, rapid COVID-19 tests, and distributed goods all rely on volunteer groups formed by neighbors. As Christians, we should show others that we are actively helping our communities, Hans said. We need to help our neighbors create good order in the community. We can share the food we have, pray for our neighbors, pray with them, telling them that we are Christians. If our neighbors test positive, we don't turn our back on them. We can send them encouraging messages or videos and find out what they actually need. Elder Jiang, who is a pilot, has spent the past 3 years either flying or in isolation, which kind of seems like, I don't know whether the elder is a title of their capacity and role in the church, but it sounds like if that's their past 3 years, they really shouldn't be an elder in the church. The city's sequestration allowed him to finally spend the time at home with his wife and young son. When the community called for volunteers, he didn't hesitate to sign up and spent his days in protective clothing, organizing COVID-19 tests and distributing supplies. So this guy went full branch Covidian when the call came. A few days later, while he and his wife were infected, his 3-year-old son's antigen test came back negative. This meant that following Shanghai's quarantine policy, that the couple had to be separated from their child, but Jiang did not regret his choice. He just wished that his family could stay together during the quarantine. Like, what a simp. Like, that is some government simping nutlessness. You're better off not talking to this Ava Chow person and just keeping that to yourself. I get that they live in a totalitarian regime. I get that. But you're volunteering to help the regime be the regime. And then you're like, well, I wish that we could have stayed together during quarantine, but oh well, oops. Very nonchalant. And I know that part of this is the fact that they don't want to go outside the regime, which is why they just should not be talking to Christianity Today reporters whatsoever, because to me, I think they're bearing a false witness here on what's going on. And let's not pretend like being the Branch Covidian manager, Karen, homeowners association type in your community is being a good neighbor. That's not being a good neighbor. You're literally administering tests that keep people in tyranny. Now, if you were sabotaging the test so that everyone could test negative, that'd be one thing. But that's not what he's doing. And if he were doing that, he probably wouldn't say, but I doubt he's doing that because he tested positive. For when we love our neighbors, we show them what God is. We manifest God's love. And when we not only love our neighbors but commit ourselves to our communities, we testify to God's principles and manifest his wisdom. To me, it does seem like there might not be a clear understanding of the gospel here. But again, this is a Christianity Today reporter or someone who's writing for the Christianity Today. So I very likely that the people that they talk to are not very well versed on what the gospel is, because it seems like the mentality here is very communist in that they have such a community emphasis on the gospel, which is, again, not what the gospel is. But that's just, if I wanted to take insights or glean insights on what the challenges of that of what the church in China is, aside from just a government, but on a theological basis, I would have to imagine that now understanding the gospel might actually be a major issue. It's a major issue in the United States, don't get me wrong. But I'm seeing parallels where there's such an emphasis on community and work. So in addition, Han believes that opening oneself up and sharing one's weaknesses in front of others, both believers and unbelievers, is also a way for the Christian community to witness. In the midst of the pandemic, members of his church, who used to hold each other at arm's length and were predominantly elite white-collar workers, shared for the first time their anxieties about the epidemic, their worries about the lack of supplies at home, and their problems in child-rearing and marriage. Because of their authenticity, non-Christians no longer turned away from Christians, but can come before God as sinners with real needs and a call on God's love. That sounds very American. And it also sounds very seeker-sensitive. We may be going through the biggest crisis in the 2 years since we planted a church, but this particular experience has also shown us that what was planted before the epidemic is now blossoming. As we enter the last week of Easter, I'm especially reminded that the hope of the resurrection determines our state at this moment. The more we believe in the resurrection, the lighter we look at the hardships of this moment. Han added, he has spent more time with his co-workers in the church over the past few weeks, praying with them and making sure that they are spiritually healthy. It is the hope in these Shanghai Christians' heart that when the virus is no longer resides in the city, the church will be a better companion of people and builder of community, bringing people closer to each other and people's hearts closer to God. Again, it equates those two, which you see a lot of that in the woke church. You see a lot of that mentality of, the gospel is about bringing people closer to God and people closer to each other. That's not the gospel. The gospel is just about reconciling our relationship with God. Now, Christians should have a good relationship in loving one another. That's a commandment that God gives us. That's an obedience issue, not a gospel issue. But anyway, it's just cringe that Christianity Today did not have any skepticism that the lockdowns were about anything other than COVID. Because, let's just put a conspiracy hat on it for a minute. Do you really think this is about COVID? Do you really think that 2 years later that China is just now adopting a zero tolerance policy? Or are they worried about some other uprising and are taking proactive measures using a very elaborate, not a lie, it is a lie that COVID's a threat to Shanghai, but they're using a very elaborate scheme, a very elaborate ruse to crack down on dissidents. What if that's actually the issue here? That they are more concerned about a civil unrest in China, and specifically the Shanghai area, than they are about COVID-19. So that's the issue that I'm seeing with the Christian response to this, is that they're touting the regime narrative. Now, Christian Post also touted the regime narrative by ignoring the plight of the Chinese. Whereas Christianity Today is going to celebrate a specific person, some people in the church that, they're being their local community COVID Nazi. So that's not worth celebrating. That's really not. So anyway, that's all I got to say about that. My name is Ray. This is the Evangelical Dark Web. If you like this kind of content, also subscribe to the channel and check out evangelicaldarkweb.org. And I will catch you on the next one.